Patty Cannon, c. 1759-1829. Also known as the leader of the Cannon, Johnson Gang, she was one of the most notorious female criminals in early U.S. history. Round Pushpin location. Operated mainly along the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. Detective what she did. She led a kidnapping ring that captured free African Americans and escaped slaves. Victims were chained, hidden, and sold back into slavery in the Deep South. She was also accused of murder, allegedly killing adults and children to keep her crimes hidden. The setting: America in the early 1800s. The early decades of the 19th century were years of contradiction in the United States. On the one hand, the ideals of liberty and independence had already been declared, fought for, and celebrated. The American Revolution was just a few generations in the past, and people still spoke of freedom, self-determination, and the rights of men. Yet beneath that patriotic pride, another America existed, one built on chains, auctions, and human misery. Slavery was still legal in large parts of the South. In Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, the border states, it sat at a crossroads between freedom and bondage. On one side were free black families, some of whom had managed to carve out lives as farmers, laborers, and small business owners. On the other side was the ever-present threat of kidnapping, forced labor, and being sold into slavery in the Deep South, where plantations stretched for miles and cotton was king. It was in this murky, dangerous borderland between freedom and captivity that one woman made her name. She would become infamous as the leader of a violent gang that preyed upon free black men, women, and even children. Her name was Patty Cannon, and her reputation was so dark that whispers of her cruelty spread across the Delmarva Peninsula. To some, she was a businesswoman. To others, she was a monster. But to everyone who knew her story, she became something more chilling, proof that evil could thrive in plain sight. Who was Patty Cannon? Patty Cannon's early life is wrapped in both fact and folklore. She was born around 1759, likely in Delaware or Maryland. Some records suggest her maiden name was Patricia Clark, though historical details are often tangled with rumor. What is known is that by the late 1700s, she had married a man named Jesse Cannon, and through him, she took the name that history would remember. Descriptions of Patty vary depending on who told the story. In some accounts, she was large, muscular, and intimidating, someone who could physically overpower victims. Others portray her as cunning and manipulative, using charm and deception rather than brute force. But in every version, she emerges as a woman who was feared, a woman who could bend men to her will, and who saw opportunity in the darkest corners of society. Her marriage to Jesse Cannon did not seem to tame her ambitions. Together with her daughter and son-in-law, Joe Johnson, Patty became involved in one of the most notorious criminal enterprises of the age, the kidnapping and slave trading ring that would terrorize the region for decades. The Cannon-Johnson Gang. To understand Patty's power, you must understand the gang she helped lead. The Cannon-Johnson Gang operated in the shadows of a divided America. The gang specialized in capturing free black people from Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, states where slavery was either fatting or had already been abolished, and selling them illegally into slavery in the Deep South. For many black families, especially in places like Philadelphia, the threat of being kidnapped was constant. Parents feared letting their children walk alone to market. Men and women who had papers proving their free status carried them everywhere, yet even those documents could be ignored or destroyed by gangs like Patty's. The Cannon-Johnson Gang worked with chilling efficiency. They kidnapped their victims, transported them south, and sold them for profit to slave traders. Those who resisted faced brutal beatings. Some never survived the journey. Patty Cannon was not just an accomplice. She was a leader. She provided the safe houses, organized the logistics, and made sure the gang could operate for years without being caught. Her farmhouse, sitting near the border of Delaware and Maryland, became infamous. To the outside world, it looked like an ordinary home, but inside, according to testimony and later discoveries, it was a place of imprisonment, cruelty, and death. The dual faces of Patty Cannon. To her neighbors, Patty could appear almost ordinary. She lived in the small town of Reliance, then called Johnson's Crossroads, a rural community where everyone knew each other. Some people saw her as tough but respectable, a woman making her way in a harsh world. Others whispered about the strange noises at night, the visitors who came and never returned, the families that reported missing children. Patty knew how to play both roles, the hard-faced matriarch who demanded respect, and the ruthless criminal who would kill anyone who threatened her business. One local legend says she would stand on her porch, watching wagons filled with chained victims being taken south, as casually as another woman might watch her crops. Whether this is exaggeration or truth, it paints the picture of a woman who had no pity, no hesitation, and no conscience when it came to the suffering of others. The business of human lives. The kidnapping trade was lucrative. A single healthy young man could be sold for hundreds of dollars, equivalent to thousands today. For Patty and her gang, the profit was irresistible. The victims were often tricked. Sometimes, gang members offered work to unsuspecting black men, promising wages for farm labor. Other times, they kidnapped children directly from the roads. Witnesses later claimed that Patty herself would lure victims with false kindness before turning on them with violence. One chilling tale tells of a free black woman who was kidnapped with her children. When she pleaded for their release, Patty reportedly laughed and told her that families meant nothing in the face of money. Another story claims that when a captive child cried too loudly, Patty ended the noise permanently. Whether every tale is true or exaggerated by folklore, they all reflect the same truth. Patty Cannon was feared because she represented the darkest possibility of human greed. Rumors and whispers. By the early 1820s, rumors of Patty's crimes had spread widely. Newspapers in Philadelphia and Baltimore warned of kidnapping gangs, though few named her directly. The problem was proving it. Victims disappeared, but evidence was scarce. Witnesses were often too terrified to speak, and when they did, local authorities were sometimes complicit, or simply unwilling to challenge someone as powerful as Patty Cannon. She paid off allies, intimidated enemies, and built an aura of invincibility. Some even claimed that she kept the bodies of murdered captives buried on her property, a detail that later investigations would confirm in horrifying fashion. But for nearly 20 years, Patty operated in this shadowy world without serious consequence. She grew older but not weaker. If anything, the stories say, her cruelty hardened with age. She had seen men hanged, neighbors ruined, and families destroyed, but she herself remained untouchable. A woman out of time. In an era when women were expected to be submissive, domestic, and powerless, Patty Cannon was the opposite. She commanded men, ran a criminal enterprise, and terrified an entire region. Her story challenges the stereotype of women in early America. She was not only an active participant in crime, she was its architect. Some historians suggest this is why her story has endured. Male outlaws of the time, like Jesse James or John Merle, became legends. But Patty Cannon's tale carries an extra weight because she was a woman who broke every rule of her gender, not for freedom or love, but for profit and cruelty. Foreshadowing the fall. By the late 1820s, however, the walls began to close in. The Cannon, Johnson gang had grown too bold. Too many people had vanished. Too many families were missing children, and too many rumors pointed to Patty's farmhouse. In 1829, the shocking truth would come to light, and the woman who had lived like a queen of crime would face the justice she had long escaped. But before that downfall, Patty Cannon reigned as one of the most feared women in America, a predator hiding in plain sight. The machinery of kidnapping. By the early 1800s, Patty Cannon's farmhouse had become more than just a home. It was the beating heart of a criminal network. From the outside, it seemed like any other property on the Delmarva Peninsula: fields, barns, and a house sitting along a dusty road. But for those who knew its secrets, it was a prison. The Cannon, Johnson gang operated with cold precision. Riders would scour roads, towns, and markets for potential victims. They targeted free African Americans, often men traveling alone, but sometimes entire families. The methods varied. Sometimes victims were lured with promises of work. Other times they were seized by force in the dead of night. Once captured, victims were taken to Patty's farmhouse. The building had hidden rooms and cellars where captives were chained. Some accounts claim she kept victims in small, dark spaces with little food or water. The terror was not just in the kidnapping itself, but in the uncertainty. Victims had no idea if they would be sold, freed, or killed. Profit in flesh. The business was brutally simple. A free black man in Delaware might have been working as a laborer, earning wages, supporting his family. Once captured, that same man could be sold to traders in the Deep South for hundreds of dollars. Children were even more valuable: young, healthy, and able to work for decades. For Patty, every human being represented profit. There were no names, no families, just bodies to be chained and sold. Witnesses later described wagon loads of captives leaving her property, bound together, their cries ignored. The path southward was called the Reverse Underground Railroad, a cruel mirror of the freedom network that smuggled enslaved people north. While abolitionists fought to rescue, Patty Cannon thrived by betraying. The victims' stories. Though time has blurred many details, fragments of testimony and folklore preserve the voices of Patty's victims. One story tells of a young boy named Isaac, no more than 10 years old, who was walking home when he was seized. His parents searched frantically, but Isaac was gone. Years later, a man who escaped from a southern plantation claimed he had known a boy matching Isaac's description, sold by kidnappers who operated near the Maryland border. Another account speaks of a woman with 3 children, lured by the promise of domestic work. She was taken to Patty's farm, where her children were ripped from her arms. The woman was sent south, but the children were never seen again. Whether these stories are fully factual or carried in oral tradition, they reveal the terror that communities felt. Every disappearance carried the shadow of Patty Cannon's name. Murder in the shadows. Selling captives was profitable, but it also brought risks. Victims could escape, identify their captors, or testify in court. For Patty, this was unacceptable. Multiple accounts suggest that she killed those who posed a threat. Some victims were beaten to death. Others, according to chilling testimony, were poisoned. The most horrifying claims say she murdered infants, babies born to women held captive, because they slowed down transport or made too much noise. When her property was later searched, investigators reported finding bones and skulls buried near her house, confirming at least some of the rumors. Neighbors recalled that Patty had often dismissed suspicious behavior with a cold laugh, claiming that people exaggerated. But the truth was darker than even the rumors had guessed. Fear in the community. By the mid-1820s, black communities in Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania lived in constant fear of kidnapping. Parents warned children never to stray far from home. Men carried documents proving their free status, but these could be torn up or ignored by kidnappers. Newspapers occasionally reported missing persons, but justice was elusive. Law enforcement was weak, sometimes corrupt, and often complicit. Some sheriffs looked the other way, others accepted bribes. In many cases, kidnapped people were taken so far south so quickly that even if families raised alarms, the victims had vanished into the vast system of slavery. Patty Cannon's gang thrived in this environment. She was ruthless, but she was also clever. She knew when to move, when to hide, and when to silence those who might speak. The brutality of power. What made Patty especially terrifying was her willingness to use violence personally. Unlike many gang leaders who directed from afar, she reportedly participated in beatings and killings. Witnesses described her as having a hard face, with no compassion in her eyes. One particularly gruesome story, preserved in local legend, tells of a captive man who refused to be chained. Patty, rather than waiting for her men, picked up an iron poker from the fireplace and struck him until he collapsed. Whether this tale is literal truth or folklore, it reflects the image she carried, a woman who ruled through terror. Even those in her gang feared her. Some claimed that Joe Johnson, her own son-in-law, took orders reluctantly, knowing that Patty's temper could be as deadly to her allies as to her enemies. She was not a partner in crime, she was the boss. The reverse Underground Railroad. To understand Patty Cannon's crimes, one must see them as part of a larger system. The reverse Underground Railroad was not unique to her gang. Across the border states, free black families faced the threat of being dragged south into slavery. But Patty's operation was among the most organized and ruthless. She had safe houses, routes, and contacts with Southern traders. She was not a small-time criminal. She was part of an economy of kidnapping that profited off America's racial divisions. The irony was cruel. While abolitionists like Harriet Tubman would later risk their lives to guide enslaved people north to freedom, Patty Cannon and her gang worked just as hard to drag free people south into bondage. One side represented hope, the other despair. The infamy grows. By the late 1820s, Patty Cannon's name had become infamous across Delaware and Maryland. Whispers grew louder. Stories of missing children and buried bodies began to circulate. For years, people had been too afraid to accuse her openly. But now, cracks were forming in her empire. Newspapers began printing more stories of kidnappings. Families demanded answers. Some members of her own gang were rumored to be considering betrayal, afraid that Patty's increasing recklessness would bring them all down. For Patty herself, age was catching up. Now in her 60s, she was still feared but no longer untouchable. She had lived decades as a predator, but the world was beginning to close in. Foreshadowing the discovery. The breaking point came when investigators, finally acting on years of suspicion, searched her property. What they found would shock the region. Human remains buried near her house, silent evidence of years of murder. Patty Cannon, who had once seemed untouchable, would soon face the consequences of her crimes. Her arrest was the beginning of the end, but also the moment when her name was sealed in history. Whispers turned into accusations. For years, the people of Delaware and Maryland had whispered about Patty Cannon. Families told stories of loved ones disappearing after traveling near her home. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about strange cries heard at night, or of wagons leaving her property under cover of darkness. Some even claimed they had seen people chained inside her barns. But in the early 1820s, whispers began to turn into action. Local authorities, long accused of looking the other way, were under mounting pressure. Black families were demanding justice, and newspapers had begun reporting openly on the growing epidemic of kidnappings. The reverse Underground Railroad was no longer a secret, it was a scandal. Patty Cannon was at the heart of it, and soon the mask she had worn for decades would slip. The discovery of bones. In 1829, the rumors became undeniable. A search of Patty Cannon's property revealed a horror buried in plain sight: bones, skulls, and human remains hidden near her house. Accounts differ on how many were found. Some say a handful, others claim dozens, but the discovery was enough to confirm what many had feared. For years, neighbors had joked darkly that Patty must have been burying bodies on her land. Now the grim truth lay exposed in the soil. Victims who had vanished without explanation were not in the Deep South, as many families had believed. They were in shallow graves behind Patty's farmhouse. The news spread like wildfire. Newspapers described the House of Horrors, where free African Americans had been held captive, beaten, and murdered. People who had once been too afraid to speak began coming forward with testimony. Patty Cannon, who had lived untouchable for decades, was finally facing justice. Arrest and charges. Patty Cannon was arrested in 1829 in her early 60s. For the first time in her long career of crime, she was placed in custody, not as a suspect in Whispers, but as a woman formally charged with murder. The indictment named her in 4 counts of murder, though many believed she had committed far more. Prosecutors focused on the strongest evidence, the remains found on her property and the testimony of witnesses who had survived or seen her crimes. Her son-in-law, Joe Johnson, and other members of the gang were also implicated. Some tried to distance themselves from Patty, blaming her for the worst atrocities. Others feared her even in prison, reluctant to speak out fully. But the weight of evidence was growing, and Patty could no longer silence it. The wickedest woman in America. The newspapers seized on the story. Patty Cannon was soon branded as the wickedest woman in America. The public was fascinated and horrified. How could a woman, in a society that often dismissed women as weak or powerless, have orchestrated such cruelty? Writers described her as large, brutal, and merciless. Others painted her as cunning, manipulative, and calculating. Some accounts, exaggerated by rumor, claimed she had murdered dozens, perhaps even hundreds. Whether truth or legend, the image of Patty Cannon as a monstrous figure was fixed. Her farmhouse became infamous as a symbol of evil. Visitors came just to see the site where human bones had been unearthed. Even after her arrest, her name carried terror. Parents warned their children with stories of Patty Cannon's gang, long after she was gone. Inside the prison walls. While awaiting trial, Patty Cannon was held in the Georgetown jail in Delaware. She was an old woman by then, but still carried herself with the defiance of someone who had evaded capture for decades. Some accounts say she denied everything, claiming the bones were planted or that others were to blame. Others suggest she grew silent, perhaps realizing that her reign of fear was over. But one thing was clear: she would never walk free again. Even if the trial did not end with her execution, she faced a lifetime in prison. For someone who had once commanded men, wagons, and whole criminal networks, confinement was the ultimate humiliation. Death before justice. Patty Cannon never stood trial. In May 1829, while still in prison, she was found dead in her cell. The exact cause of her death is uncertain. Some reports claim she committed suicide by drinking poison, smuggling it into her cell and ending her life rather than facing the gallows. Others believe she died of natural causes, weakened by age and stress. The official record is vague, but the result was the same. Patty Cannon was gone before justice could be delivered. For some, her death was a relief. For others, it was a frustration. Families of her victims wanted her to stand trial, to face the consequences publicly, to be judged not only by the law but by history. Instead, she slipped away, leaving questions unanswered. What became of the gang? Patty's death did not end the story. Her gang, the Cannon, Johnson gang, faced trials of their own. Joe Johnson, her son-in-law, was arrested and convicted for his role in the kidnappings. Other members were pursued by law enforcement, though many escaped full punishment. The network of kidnapping did not vanish overnight, but without Patty's leadership it weakened. Communities that had once lived in fear began to breathe easier, yet the scars remained. Families who had lost children never recovered. Survivors carried trauma for life, and the legend of Patty Cannon only grew stronger. Fact and folklore. One of the challenges of telling Patty Cannon's story is separating fact from folklore. She was a real person, a real criminal, and a real murderer. But over the decades, stories about her became exaggerated, passed down through generations like ghost tales. Some say she killed infants by throwing them into fireplaces. Others claim she poisoned rivals, buried dozens of bodies, or even killed her own relatives. Not all of these stories can be proven, but they reveal how deeply she terrified people. She was not just remembered as a criminal, she was remembered as a monster. The discovery of bones on her property confirmed enough of the rumors to make the legends believable. Whether she killed 4, 10, or more, the truth is that she built a life on cruelty, and her name became a symbol of evil. Public fascination. Even after her death, Patty Cannon fascinated the public. Writers in the 19th century included her in books about crime and scandal. Local legends grew around her farmhouse, which was eventually torn down, though some claimed it remained haunted by the souls of her victims. In the 20th century, historians revisited her case, trying to separate fact from fiction. What they found was chilling. While some details may have been exaggerated, the core truth was undeniable. Patty Cannon had kidnapped, sold, and murdered African Americans for profit, and she had done so for decades with shocking success. Aftermath of a monster's death. When Patty Cannon was found dead in her jail cell in 1829, many believed the story would end there. But in truth, her death was only the beginning of her legend. The wickedest woman in America lived on in memory, in newspaper columns, in folklore, and in the whispered stories of communities who had once lived in terror of her gang. Her farmhouse became infamous. People traveled to Delaware just to see where the murders and kidnappings had taken place. Neighbors pointed to the fields where bones had been unearthed and told chilling stories of the nights they had heard screams. Even long after the house was torn down, its reputation remained. The land where Patty Cannon once ruled was cursed in the minds of many. For the African American families who had lost loved ones to her schemes, there was no true closure. Her sudden death had robbed them of a trial, of the chance to see justice served in public. For them, Patty Cannon was not just a criminal of the past. She was a wound in the fabric of their community, a reminder of how fragile freedom could be in the early 19th century. Fact versus folklore. One of the biggest challenges in studying Patty Cannon is separating the facts of her crimes from the folklore that grew around them. Historians agree she was guilty of kidnapping and murder. They agree that she led one of the most dangerous reverse underground railroad gangs in the country. They agree that bones were discovered on her property. But how many people did she kill? That question remains debated. Some historians suggest the number was closer to 4 or 5 confirmed victims. Others, drawing from local accounts, claim it could have been dozens, perhaps even hundreds. Exaggerations piled on over time. Stories circulated that she killed infants by throwing them into fires. Some claimed she poisoned rivals, while others said she murdered her own family members. The truth may never be fully known, but what matters is that communities believed these stories. Patty Cannon had become less of a person and more of a monster in local imagination. This blurring of fact and folklore has kept her memory alive. She was not just a criminal statistic, she was a ghost story, a warning, a name spoken in fear. The wickedest woman in America. Patty Cannon's story shocked 19th century America not only because of her crimes, but because of who she was. Women in the early 1800s were not typically seen as leaders of criminal empires. They were expected to be mothers, wives, and caretakers. Yet Patty defied those roles. She was brutal, calculating, and commanding, so much so that men followed her into her schemes. For many, this was what made her so terrifying. If a man committed such crimes, it was wicked but unsurprising. For a woman to do so was unthinkable. Newspapers latched onto this angle, emphasizing her gender in their coverage. She was unnatural, monstrous, a woman who had abandoned all sense of maternal instinct and humanity. In this way, Patty Cannon became a kind of dark legend proof in the minds of 19th century society, of what could happen if women strayed from their proper place. She was remembered not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of corruption and chaos. Cultural memory in the region. In Delaware and Maryland, Patty Cannon's story was passed down for generations. Parents warned their children not to wander near the woods at night, telling them, "Patty Cannon will get you." Her name became folklore, used the way some families use tales of witches or ghosts. Old-timers told stories about her house being haunted. Some said they could hear chains rattling on stormy nights. Others swore they saw the shadow of a woman standing in the window, watching the fields where bodies had once been buried. In some communities, her story became tied to the broader memory of slavery and kidnapping. She was not just a criminal, she was a symbol of the terror African Americans faced even when free. She represented how fragile safety was, how freedom could be stolen in an instant by greed and cruelty. Why the story matters. Patty Cannon's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were part of a larger system of exploitation and cruelty. She thrived in a world where the demand for enslaved labor was so strong that men and women would risk everything to steal human beings from the North and sell them in the South. Her story forces us to remember that slavery did not only oppress those already enslaved, it also endangered the free. Black families living in the so-called free states were constantly under threat of kidnapping. The line between freedom and slavery was thin, and criminals like Patty Cannon profited from that vulnerability. This is why her story is important to history. It is not simply the tale of a murderer. It is the tale of how greed, racism, and corruption allowed one woman to build an empire of fear for decades. Historians' efforts. Modern historians have worked to document the truth of Patty Cannon's crimes. Some have scoured court records, old newspapers, and local archives to piece together her real story. Books have been written about her, often blending fact with the folklore that surrounded her name. Some historians argue that focusing too much on the folklore risks exaggerating her crimes beyond recognition. Others argue that the folklore itself is important because it tells us how communities remembered her, how trauma becomes legend. Either way, she remains a figure of fascination. Unlike many other criminals of her era, she has not been forgotten. Her name continues to appear in studies of slavery, women in crime, and American folklore. The legend today. Today, nearly 200 years after her death, Patty Cannon is still remembered. Local museums in Delaware and Maryland sometimes tell her story. History enthusiasts write about her as one of America's earliest and most infamous female serial killers. True crime communities discuss her as a figure both horrifying and mysterious. Her story has also inspired novels, plays, and even local ghost tour. Tour guides still tell visitors about the murder farm where bones were found, blending history with haunting. Yet her memory is not just entertainment. For many, especially African American communities, she is a symbol of trauma. She reminds us that the freedom won by Black Americans in the North was constantly under threat. Remembering her means remembering the victims, those who vanished, those who suffered, those whose bones were buried in silence.